Sitting out here today on the porch, it's kind of chilly, but I thought I'd tell you a story as I sit and watch my bird feeder get videoed. Today's topic is getting fired on the railroad. Where shall I begin? It seems like I was fired at least 3 times. For some reason, one time eludes me. I'll think about it. Years ago, I hadn't been working the railroad, I don't know, a year or two. I hadn't been working there too long. I was working second shift repair track. We repaired freight cars. We'd roll one through after another one. Whatever was wrong with the car, we'd fix it. Push another one in there and repair it. But I was working track 2 on the rip track. Mr. Fred Brown, he's no longer with us. He was the general foreman at the time. I don't know if he's trying to make a name for himself or what. He wanted everybody to know he was the boss. He was like Hitler or somebody. Now, like I say, I was working the second shift repair track. And in yesterday's blog, I talked to you about repacking oil in boxes, journal boxes. Well, that's one of the jobs of a carman. Out in the train yard, 2 carmen were working oil in journals. We call it box packing. Their names were, I don't guess it would matter. Since this is a true story, it don't matter if I get their name or not. But it was Eddie Martin and Benny Ledford. They had been working a year or 2 longer than I had. They were out there packing boxes. Well, here comes Fred Brown, General Foreman Brown, out on the rip track. Tells the car foreman on the rip track he needs somebody to get an oil can to come to the forwarding yard. Well, they told some of the older men. The older men said, "No, get a younger man. I ain't going out there, and it's cold and dark out there in the train yard." Well, everybody passed it on till they got to the lowest man on the totem pole that night, which happened to be me. "Parks, you got to go." I said, "Well, there ain't nobody else I can send because nobody's junior to me out here in seniority." I went and got an oil can, filled it up with oil, went out in the train yard looking for Mr. Brown. Well, I found him and Ben Jones. He was a car foreman at the time. Later became a derrick foreman. I found them out track 3, track 4, somewhere out there in the forwarding yard, and they were waiting for me. "Open that journal box, Parks." I pulled the box lid open. "You see any oil in that box?" I said, "No, sir, I don't see no oil in that box." "Look and make sure." "I'm looking right in there, Mr. Brown. I can see there ain't no oil up in that box." Pour some oil in there. I put some oil in there and closed the lid. Moved to the next box. We went on down the train, checking different boxes. And several of them, there was no visible oil in the box. Well, he had me walk the whole train, but he called Mr. Martin and Mr. Ledford out there, gave them a what for, gave them a lecture standing there by the train, had me open a box. There was no visible oil in it. Said, "Look in that box. Do you see any oil, Mr. Martin?" "No, I don't see no oil in there." "Well, didn't you just work this train?" "Yes, sir." "Well, is this what I pay you for? Do I pay you to do this kind of work? You're not doing your job." Well, I was glad to get away from them. I went ahead and finished the oil in the boxes on the train, went back to the repair track. Well, there's only a couple things you can get fired for on the railroad that would really be permanent. Stealing is one. I've seen that happen several times over the years. And drugs or alcohol, that's pretty well you're gone for sure, because especially now everything is zero tolerance. They weren't totally zero tolerance back in the old days. A lot of the old heads kept a bottle of liquor in their locker. Things were different back then, and it took the railroad a while to change. But like I say, over the years, I was fired a couple times. Anyway, come time for the investigation to fire those 2 men for the oil in the boxes. They called me in the office just before the investigation was to start wanted to know what I was going to say at the investigation. I said, you mean I got to come in there? Yeah, you got to come in there. You got to tell what you saw. All right. Well, Mr. Brown calls me in his office. I sit down there and he says, what are you going to say? I said, what do you want me to say? He said, I want you to say them boxes was dry. No, sir, I can't say that. Do what? I said, well, I'm honest. I'll tell you the truth. I'll tell the investigation the truth. But I ain't going to lie. What do you mean lying? Them boxes was dry. I said, no, sir. Them boxes had no visible oil in them. I can't say that lube pad up under there hadn't sucked up a bunch of oil and was still oily. I didn't put my hand up in there and feel of them damn pads. So you won't say they're dry. I said, no, sir. I'll say there was no visible oil in them boxes. I went back to the repair truck. Wasn't long, got time for the investigation to start. Called me in there and started their little procedure of getting ready to fire the two men. And he had reworded his whole thing from dry boxes to no visible oil. I said, yes, sir, I can say there was no visible oil in there. But he had Ben Jones, who was the car foreman out there with him. They had him get up and testify. What did you see when you looked in them boxes, Mr. Jones? Them boxes were bone dry, Mr. Jones said. I've been working at the railroad 30 years, and I've never seen boxes that dry. Well, he was just saying what Mr. Brown wanted him to say. They called me up there, and I said, no, sir, I can't say them boxes were dry. I'd say there was no visible oil in them. Well, Mr. Martin and Mr. Ledford got fired for 6 months and 1 day. That was the longest I've seen anybody leave there and still get back and get their job. But the labor board, when you got a union, pretty well get you back to work unless you've done something really serious. When it comes to getting fired, I knew my day would be coming for them to get even with me. Some years later, Mr. Brown was now the master mechanic or the head boss. He was no longer a general foreman. But they sent me and David Ellington out to Chambly to re-rail some box cars that got derailed when they were shoving over towards the BOP plant. It's a General Motors plant, but it's a General Motors assembly plant. I had the truck backed up with a big boom on it. It was a big truck, and I had this steel replacer lifted up in the air, swinging that boom around to lower that replacer down right by the box car. But as I was coming down, this part of the boom over the cab kind of mashed down on a marker light on top of the cab of the truck. But I was busy watching the other end of the boom, which was hanging from a chain, watching that replacer. So I didn't injure anyone. The people were standing around. As the boom was coming down, that boom pushed on that marker light, and when it did, it exploded the windshield of the truck. It didn't damage it broke the marker light, but it didn't damage the cab. But it did completely explode the front windshield right out of the truck. We drove the truck back that evening to Emmons Yards with no windshield. Come time for the investigation, Mr. Brown decided it was his time to get even with me. He made up his mind that I had dropped the windshield. He made up his mind that I had dropped the replacer through the windshield of the truck. Well, I had a train master and everybody else with me. I had plenty of witnesses. I could have beat the rep. But they came to me and talked to me between sessions and told me, he wants to get even with you. You better take a couple of days off on vacation. Just consider it an unpaid vacation. You better go ahead and take whatever he wants to give you. And he'll call it even. But he wants some payback, a retribution, for the time you made him look like a fool at Martin and Ledford investigation. Well, I thought about it. I don't want him hassling me from now on, since he's the big boss. I said, okay, I'll take the rap. But you know and I know I didn't break that windshield. I got fired for 3 days for that one. And I probably shouldn't have did it. I probably should have fought it. I could have beat him at the local board. But in the meantime, it might have took me 6 months to get back to work. And, well, I'm taking my 3 days and get my ass back to work. I can't afford to lose 6 months. That was one time I got fired. I got fired 2 more times over the years. That'll have to be a different story. That's going to conclude my story for today.